Welcome to the Computational Antitrust podcast. My name is Thibaut Schrepel. I am a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center and an associate professor of law at the VU Amsterdam, and also the creator of the Computational Antitrust project, which explores how legal informatics can benefit antitrust law. The project, as you must know by now, brings together over 65 competition agencies and 35 academics in the advisory board. Each month or so, we publish an academic article on the subject of computational antitrust. You may find all of those publications at computationalantitrust.com. Today, I am thrilled to be receiving John McCaskill, who is a clinical professor of nonprofit management in the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences at the University of Texas at Dallas, a place I never visited, but hopefully one day. John co-authored a paper for us entitled Antitrust Policy and Blockchain Technology, an exploration from the complex systems perspective. So John, welcome first of all. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to appear with you. I'm looking forward to this.
I'm very pleased, as we were just discussing before starting the recording. Your paper combines pretty much all of the subjects I've been obsessed with, being complexity and blockchain and agent-based modeling. So without further ado, we can get started. And so my first usual question is, could you please summarize the main message of your paper in just 2 minutes or so?
Certainly. The approach that we were interested in taking was to look at something as interesting as blockchain, and that has as much potential as it does, to just look at it from a standard Newtonian perspective, if you will, won't do it justice, and could lead to some rather unforeseen and adverse outcomes, if particularly in the policy realm, if we're not careful about how we approach this. And we thought, looking at it from the perspectives of of complex adaptive systems, and keeping in mind the tendency for these things to become lock-ins, if you will, as far as how the markets evolve, could lead to some preferred outcomes. And there's some examples that we've seen where complexity science and agent-based modeling as a tool were used that avoided an awful lot of pratfalls that actually in other areas caused a great deal of angst.
Well, there is a lot, of course, we could unpack already. You mentioned a Newtonian perspective, which is pretty much the way by which we approach the law, generally speaking, right? As if it was physics and something you could just fine-tune somewhere. But what I like very much, and something that I think you do very well in the paper, is that you build on top of previous sections. And so I guess we here have to start from the layer one, complexity science, that you mentioned already quite a few times. To me, the way I approach the subject is that you tend to look at dynamics between agents, so their relationships and how those relationships will evolve, as opposed to just looking at the agent per se. But could you please maybe explain what is your take on complexity science? I just finished quite a few books on the subject, and they pretty much all agree that there is no official definition of what complexity is. So I'm very much interested in your take on it before we dive into the blockchain space.
Right. It's interesting that you say that, because I've had the same experience with because I want to bring this to students and say, well, here it is. This is the answer. And now I can put it on a multiple choice test and see what you do with it. But the way that I kind of like to approach it, at least in my way of thinking, and just a warning, I'm kind of a divergent thinker, so bear with me. But I like to describe it by what it is not, and it is not a complicated system. It's a complex system, and so the difference between those two is significant in that complicated is like your car engine. It's, or a 747 or something like that. You can, if you take enough time, you can determine what each one of these pieces is going to do, and as they combine, they're very predictable. It's you walk out to your car, you turn the key, and provided that nothing bizarre has happened, it'll start and off you go. Where complex systems are quite different in that they're not predictable. And just because we understand what one of the parts does doesn't mean that we understand how that part is going to interact with other parts, even though they may have very simple rules that they're following. So I guess one of the things that is interesting about complex systems is their exquisite sensitivity to initial conditions, and the fact that we can't control them, we can only guide and react to them. So it's this lack of predictability of what the system is going to do as it progresses along in time with these interactions, and the way that and the fact that all we can do is guide and respond. We cannot really control.
Yeah, which, just to be clear, and I think that appears very clearly in the paper, it doesn't mean that because a system is complex, then you should just give up, right?
Right,
there
absolutely.
is one definition that is being used sometimes, is that a complex system is more than the sum of its parts. But it means that indeed, after you take a step back, there is a sum, there is something that you can study, although you do not really understand why the system is reacting in a certain way, but there is an outcome that you can study. So this is certainly why I think this might be interesting to indeed try to transpose that in the realm of blockchain, because you could describe blockchain in a very technical and Newtonian way, I suppose, once again, where you would say, well, blockchain is taking a bunch of encryption techniques and mixing all that with some sort of governance, but it wouldn't explain what is a blockchain ecosystem, and this might be why complexity is so helpful in the space. So I'm curious to hear from you as to why do you think that complexity science is especially well tailored to understand blockchain ecosystems?
Well, and just as you said, it's because of the interaction of the agents. It's not necessarily the agents themselves that are so interesting, because as you very well stated, blockchain is pretty basic. I mean, it's a tool, and it's not there's nothing magical necessarily about blockchain itself or the technology behind it. It's that's relatively easy to understand, but it's these agents that are using the blockchain and the way that they interact with each other that is actually the fascinating part behind that, and the things that they could to use a colloquialism, the things that they could get up to while using this technology. That's really the area that makes complexity science so appropriate, because it's this building from the bottom up and not really being able to control it from the top down, because you can't predict necessarily how all these agents are going to interact, because there's probabilities in there, and so you can get ideas and trends of how these things are going to go, but you really can't just from an iron fist type or a deity like perspective control what these things are doing.
And on that, for the listeners, especially not familiar with complexity science, there are researchers in the space trying to come up with a theory of everything, using some common characteristics that will explain pretty much everything. So the way we build cities, the way the birds will fly, and the way blockchain will function. And pretty much, I think everyone will agree that we are far from reaching that theory. However, it doesn't mean, again, that you can't extract some basic principles as to how systems evolve. And I'm mentioning that because I know it's sexy to say that blockchains does not exist because each blockchain is different, so it doesn't even make sense to use one word to describe all of those different ecosystems. But you can make the very same point when it comes to firms. Every firm is different, And yet we understand that there are a certain way by which a firm function, namely, a vertical command and control power. And you could say the exact same for blockchains. They are pretty much all different, and yet there are indeed common characteristics when it comes to the interactions between all the agents, which I think is what complexity may actually allow you to capture. I don't know if you have any reaction.
Yeah, no, I would very much agree with that. That's and the other thing too is the thing that we're always struggling against is that with the old adage that all models are wrong, but some are useful. As far as we try to mentally understand what's going on and to make sense of it, the idea that when we approach this whole understanding of how these things are interacting and that as you say, each one is different, but yet the similarities are there to try to tease out and what's going on. It reminds me of something that Nassim Taleb said about these things, referring to causal opacity and our difficulty in trying to determine what truly was the cause of this thing as it worked its way through a complex adaptive system. Because just the fact of observing, it's much like quantum mechanics. Much when you observe the this issue that's going on that you're interested in, just by observing it, you change it, you impact it. So it's one of those things that again is just this fascinating phenomenon to try to get your mind around.
Which is something that we discussed quite a few times in this podcast, namely the fact that if you, and we will in a second dive into computational antitrust, but of course, the way by which you apply antitrust and try to, understand practices and potentially design your remedies will impact the way the agents behave on the markets, and therefore, in a sense, will impact the substance of what antitrust should be. So it goes both ways. The tool will actually enable you to better understand and maybe impact the thing you are observing. And because that thing will react in a certain way, you should maybe change the tool once again. So that brings me to the computational antitrust part in your paper. Now that we agree that complexity science is helpful to capture the way a blockchain may evolve, it may mean that it will be also helpful, hopefully, to understand and better capture anti-competitive practices. And that brings us to trying to find a way to operationalize complexity. And something that you explore in the paper are agent-based modeling or agent-based simulations. The idea being that you create a computer simulation where each agent has singular characteristics. And after defining the environment, you play the simulation and you observe where the agents go. So once again, we come back to this idea of trying to observe a movement as opposed to just looking at agents individually. And so the reason why it may be helpful, especially when it comes to blockchain governance and blockchain ecosystem, is that depending on where the agents go, you may be able to document past dependency, which is something that concerns antitrust, lock-in, the fact that the ecosystem is being frozen, or the fact that the ecosystem is actually finding an equilibrium. And here, something that we may want to consider is that, as John Holland once said, if it's in equilibrium, it must be dead. And if it's dead, if it doesn't move, it means there is no competition. Because if you feel competitive pressure, then the ecosystem will keep on moving. So with all that in mind, here's my question. Where and how can we use agent-based modeling in the space of blockchain antitrust?
Well, and I would kind of answer that with an example of how some of these other rather complex markets have used agent-based modeling in the past. And this example actually comes from the Argonne National Lab. And I had an opportunity to sit in a course up there with some gentleman that done a had been involved in the energy markets, particularly the deregulation of the electricity markets in various states. And so they gave the example of what they tried to do in California versus what they did in Illinois. California, they just came up with what they thought, this top-down command control model of, well, we're going to deregulate this, and this is how we think everybody's going to respond. And they did it. And the next thing you know, Pacific Gas and Electric, the only way that they were going to remain successful was if we allowed them to print money. And our friends from Enron were heavily involved in that whole unwinding of that attempt at deregulation. Where in the Illinois example, they actually sat down and used and devised an agent-based model to not necessarily predict, but to explore the possible outcomes from different policy initiatives, and to be able to look at it. And what they discovered was, if they would have done what they were planning to do initially, even after having looked at the California example, they would have had the same outcome. They would have had this market failure, basically, where there would have been where dramatic government intervention would have been required, and everything that we're loath to do in a free market economy would have come to pass. But they were able to look at some of the tendencies that, because these agents, there's proto agents that don't learn anything, and they just continue to go on with their programming and their propensities, and they'll do that. But true agent-based or agents will learn from the interactions that they have, and they can actually observe others if you get a model that has good fidelity to it, and they'll observe what's going on. And when they see, and that's exactly what happens in the markets, is some of the agents that, it's like, well, that's outlier behavior, that wouldn't happen, that's just a strange phenomenon. But if the other agents are able to observe one becoming successful doing that, there's going to be a tendency toward homogeneity of the way that they respond to these things. And all of a sudden, you'll see this big surge of what you thought couldn't happen. All of a sudden, your black swan appears, and then wreaks havoc in the market, and all of those things. So it's one of those types of things that if policymakers would, and these things take time. That's the problem. Is because you need to get enough input to be sure that you're looking at the right thing. With the agent-based model, and that you're even observing the proper variables. But if you can get enough domain experts together and kind of talk through some of these things to be sure that your model is capturing, at least to the best of human ability, the important factors in there, you can now begin to explore these different things, much like and to use Holland again, the idea of a flight simulator, to go ahead and kind of test drive this policy where nobody gets hurt. I mean, it's really nice to be able to just hit the reset button on the computer program versus trying to hit reset when people's livelihoods are at stake is quite a bit different.
Several reactions. The first, you mentioned something which is, I think, very important. The ability to observe what the other agents will do and to adapt your own behaviors according to that. There is one website, I don't know if you are familiar with it, but in any case, for all of our listeners, that website is called The Evolution of Trust. It's a video game. If you just Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo that, you will find this. And you will play a game where basically you have to put a coin in a machine, and another player will react to the way by which you play the game. And it's very interesting. You will see there are different rounds, but it pretty much captures this idea that the ability to observe behaviors may impact the entire game, which is something that also has been integrated, of course, in game theory and in the prisoner dilemma. So again, here we come back to this idea of trying to avoid the kind of way by which we look at the law, which very much relies on physics as opposed to biology. This was the first reaction. The second one, you mentioned something which I think is especially relevant when it comes to blockchain and antitrust. The fact that when you use agent-based modeling, the objective might not be to predict the future. So it won't tell you that in the Bitcoin blockchain, in 2 years from now, you will see collusion between miners, or after the merge of the Ethereum blockchain. But what you might see using agent-based modeling is that if you change a small part of the ecosystem, it will actually lead to a totally different outcome, which will mean that the ecosystem here may vary and reach different states, which is already relevant information when you are a policymaker, of course, because it means that potentially different states of the world are possible, and you may influence one state and prefer one state over the other. So again, I'm curious to hear if you have any reaction.
Well, and what you're saying has actually been apparent to us if we cared to look all the way back to the I think it was early 1960s with when Lorenz was working with his he had a weather modeling program, and it had, I believe, 12 variables. And he had it run through and the thing ran for, this was in the early days of computing, it ran for several days, and it predicted an outcome. And he thought, well, it's a deterministic system. So he inadvertently truncated, I think he was using out to 13 decimals, and he was going to try to speed it up, and he dropped it to 6. And then he ran it again, and he came back 24 hours later, and it had gone in a completely divergent direction. And so this one small change, I mean, we're talking, and I probably exaggerated that. He went from 13 to 10, some small level of change in the number of decimal places that he went out to in these factors, yet it just wildly separated it. So he was he was one of the first, I think, to really document this sensitivity that these ecosystems, as you say, can have when you change conditions. I mean, that was kind of my point. My dissertation dealt with using agent-based modeling to examine counterinsurgency applications are there best practices that are universal and that we should consider? And the answer is no. Each one of these things is its own system, and and there's going to be variables that you cannot measure with enough fidelity to say, oh, you should absolutely do this, because if you do, you're kind of setting yourself up for a problem, at least a letdown in your expectations at a minimum.
I suppose one thing you can do, though, is to monitor certain systems or ecosystems of the others. And I'm here thinking about ecosystems that would be anti-fragile, again, to quote Nassim Taleb, right? So where you see that changing the variables of an ecosystem will still lead to a similar result because the system evolved in a way which is more predictable than another. There, I would understand how it would make sense for a policymaker to model different blockchain functioning and ecosystems and try to monitor one that has a tendency to move towards a outcome that is anti-competitive, right? Tendency that is more accurate than another one where the way of functioning is more chaotic and therefore really impossible to predict. And to come back to your paper here, what you do, and something I enjoyed very much, is that you take most of the anti-competitive practices that are generally seen on the market, going from tying to predatory pricing and margin squeeze and et cetera, et cetera. And what you try to show is that you could use agent-based modeling to predict whether certain practices are more likely to happen than others,
Right.
which doesn't mean that for sure you can predict the future, but again, shows a tendency. And that's the beauty of complexity science. It actually tries to predict a movement, again, as opposed to just looking at it from a more static way. I do have another questions regarding agent-based modeling. So you do mention indeed the possibility to use open source software to try to run those simulations, and you do mention NetLogo that is indeed available for free on the web. I'm curious to hear from you, especially because you wrote your dissertation on the subject. Do you think that when it comes to competition agencies, let's say we are dealing with a competition agency with no computer science expertise and just a bunch of economists, would you be comfortable advising that agency to invest in agent-based modeling? How difficult do you think this might be for someone who's not an expert in all that?
You bring up a fascinating question, and one of the things that about the modeling community, at least from everything that I've experienced with it, is it is very much an open source community. So I think being able to, for policymakers, particularly when the stakes are significant, would almost be remiss in not attempting to find some level of expertise, and it's available in a relatively straightforward manner. I mean, the Computational Social Science Society, I believe, is there's a number of people and that are in that look at these things on how markets interact and all of these other things. It's almost becoming kind of ubiquitous to be able to find these folks. Because the state of Illinois used the expertise that was resident at the Argonne National Lab in the U.S. That was one of the things, and there are many areas like that are available that are they're associated with universities, and so you have this resident expertise there in doing the modeling. They may not have the expertise in that particular area that they're looking at, as you mentioned, having a number of economists, but those would be the domain experts that would then be able to provide the necessary fleshing out, if you will, of what these variables of interest are. And then the modelers, it's relatively straightforward. You don't necessarily you don't necessarily need to have to take a commercial airline flight, you don't necessarily need to have a pilot rating. You trust that the people in the front of the plane have a distinct interest in getting you safely to the destination. So that's one of those types of things where I think as the field has grown and progressed, that I see calls for this all the time, that people are interested in, or various governments are interested in looking at things, everything from environmental issues to commuter issues to how they're going to work with those things, and or healthcare. And so they're using these I guess centers of excellence, if you will, of modeling to then be able to do that.
So, in a nutshell, if you are looking for the expertise, you will find it, right? If you are interested in that, agencies might be able to find that, and of course, they can always send you an email, I suppose, as well.
Right. Or they can, or there's literally, I would because there's, and the interesting thing is that Europe has I don't know that they're necessarily ahead of the U.S., but they are certainly leading in this area as far as using agent-based modeling in their policy design.
So we published about a month ago a annual report where we asked agencies to let us know about where they were using computational tools. So far, we haven't heard from agencies using agent-based modeling. That's actually something that we discussed with the CMA, the UK Competition Agency, in the annual conference. But yeah, I would be surprised if we were not to see progress in the space here as well, especially as you said, the expertise is available. If you again download NetLogo, you may play with software a little bit and start designing your own very easy simulation with a Sailor Automata. But yeah, it works and it's fun. Let me ask you this last and final question, which is also one that I always ask my guests here. Where do you think we'll be in 10 years from now regarding what we can achieve in the field of competition law or antitrust using computational tools? Maybe here we want to focus on agent-based modeling.
I always think that things are going to move more rapidly than they do, but then about the time I settle on that, I'm surprised, and we make a sudden jump. I think this is going to be kind of a slow evolution, and it's not going to be the fault of the tools. I think it's going to be more of the path dependency again, that we are creatures of habit, and we have an awful lot of people that are still in the policy environment that look more like me than like you. So I don't know how rapidly we're going to be able to make that paradigm shift, because that's what it's going to basically require to be able to effectively use this in antitrust, because there are an awful lot of stakeholders involved in that have an awful lot of interest at stake. And so anytime there are parties with a lot of skin in the game, if you will, they're going to be resistant to changing or shifting this paradigm, because almost by definition, the way we view the world is that's going to create winners and losers. And anybody that perceives they are going to lose is going to resist this pretty fiercely. So there may be one of those, a punctuation in the equilibrium that that we seem to be oscillating around now, as far as how we're doing this, which is kind of we're using our computational tools on the fringes to get that to go mainstream. I think there's going to have to be some type of watershed event in there to cause that, because as a slow evolution, it may take another generation before we finally get our teeth really fully engaged. But blockchain, and in particular the Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrencies, I think may create that watershed moment that causes us to need to use computational tools, because of the very nature of the events that we're trying to understand. And that's, yeah. So to come full circle, I think I've talked myself back into, we may see a lot more computational modeling techniques used in policy, and it will probably have been precipitated by this cryptocurrency revolution.
To some degree, you could say that most of the significant advances when it comes to science, and to some degree years later in the policy world, are made and explained by new tools. And I was thinking, as you were answering my question, that it might be the opposite this time around, because blockchain may actually trigger the need to use computational tools. But if you consider that blockchain is itself a tool, then we again come back full circle, and this might be that because of the use of a new way to transact, we need to change indeed the way by which we see the world, and adapt and use agent-based modeling and other techniques, and give some room to complexity science. To quote a very famous astrophysicist, the 21st century might be the one of complexity science, or I think he actually said is the one of complexity. So we'll see if we are right on this one. In any case, it has been a real pleasure to talk about all of those very interesting topics with you. So thank you very much. I hope we see each other in person, hopefully in Texas and not in Amsterdam. I'm told that the food is better over here. So see you very soon. And to everyone listening to us, again, your paper is available on our website, computationalantitrust.com. See you very soon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.